Well, we know where we are.
You really have to speak.
Welcome again. And this should be a very special occasion, an occasion really of optimism, in my view, that we'll be able to talk about the past and an extremely scholarly and interesting work that Kai Hebel has now published, except the publishers can't bear to circulate it yet. The delights of publishing life. And we've got an hour and a bit of what we should be really interesting conversation based upon the CSCE, which, as most of you know, was an immensely complicated phase from the early 1970s. And it's one that has many narratives woven into it. And I think that's what makes it complicated, but it also makes it extremely interesting for historians, for scholars of British politics, for those international relations theorists who can hack it with multilateralism and decision-making in complex environments, and the end of the Cold War, and also its potential relevance or irrelevance to the politics, international politics of today. Now, we've got a stellar lineup here. I'm Anne Deighton, by the way. This is Kai Hebel, who is going to talk to us first of all and present his work. He's going to use PowerPoint, so be prepared for anything to go wrong. And then Professor Paul Betts will respond briefly and succinctly, I'm sure, and cogently is the word I'm searching for. And then Tim Gartonash, Professor Gartonash of Oxford and Stanford, will also comment briefly, and then we'll open it up to discussion from the floor. And we very much welcome discussions both from senior members of the university, but also from those of you who are actively researching and not having to teach and administer at the same time. Oh, joy for those people doing that. So without further ado, we will start with Kai's introduction. By the way, that is what the cover of the book looks like. It's splendid. I think Kai's going to show it on his PowerPoint. But it's a good taster for what we may see in the future when Routledge gets going. So Kai, the floor is yours. If you'd like to talk from there, I think it'll be visible as well.
Now's the first time for something to go wrong. Let's see. Oh, there you go. So first of all, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the wonderful panelists for taking the time. It is always a professional pleasure to speak at Oxford, but this is also a genuine personal pleasure for me to be here tonight. This is actually the very room in which it feels like 50, 60 years ago, I took an excellent course called European International History when I didn't encounter the CSCE for the first time, but for the first time started to seriously think about Helsinki and this diplomatic masterpiece called the Helsinki Final Act. So it's a real honor and a real pleasure to be here. Anne is going to keep me on a tight leash, right? So she's going to tell me when I have 5 minutes left, because as some of you in the audience painfully know, my enthusiasm for the topic knows no boundaries, but I'll try to keep it short. I'll try to set the scene first and say why the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe is important, and then move on to the core of the subject matter of the book, which is Britain's heretofore unoverlooked contribution to this diplomatic masterpiece. So first of all, when the Conference on Security Cooperation, the CSCE, ended on the 1st of August 1975, so almost exactly 50 years ago, it received at best a mixed reaction, both by the policy community, by dissidents, but also by the press. And maybe we're going to talk about the reason for this mixed reception a little bit later, but it's now widely considered, the conference and its outcome document, the Final Act, are widely considered masterpieces of diplomacy and milestones in the history of the Cold War. So I would argue that the Helsinki Final Act is one of the most important agreements in the history of the Cold War, and arguably also one of the most important agreements in the 20th century when it comes to, at least, to Europe. Now, why people widely agree that it's important, but why specifically it's important is still contested. So there are basically two schools, and Tim has written beautifully about this in his book, In Europe's Name, the different visions of Helsinki. In my book, I basically distinguish between two schools. Both agree that Helsinki was important, but they disagree why. One is basically the conflict transformation school. So the argument is that Helsinki and the civil society mobilization that it sparked with Helsinki groups popping up all over Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, that this led to the peaceful ending, that this contributed to, in a significant way, to the peaceful ending of the Cold War. Right, so Helsinki, important. Why? Because it helped end the Cold War. The second school also agrees it's important, but for a different reason, is a school that I call in the book, a conflict management school. But basically, the argument is not so much about the long-term outcome of Helsinki and the final act, but it's more about the more immediate difference it made. So for the first time in the history of the Cold War, it institutionalized dialogue between and across the various camps. So it helped to institutionalize that dialogue. It helped to mute in a significant way the tensions between East and West. It also gave the neutral and non-aligned countries an important standing because they were included. So the importance there is not so much about what happened afterwards, but more about what happened in the years after the signing of the final act in 1975, muting the Cold War, institutionalizing dialogue, founding several regimes on important issues, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's go back to 1975. So this was a blessed time where leaders didn't tweet or truth. It was a very different time where diplomats were able to ply their trade with relatively little intervention, and the negotiations that led to the Helsinki Final Act took almost 3 years of continuous negotiation between 35 states. And it was a unique occasion in the history of the Cold War for several reasons. One was the inclusivity of the talks. As I already mentioned, 35 signatories to the Helsinki Final Act. So this was the first time that the various camps, the Warsaw Pact states, the NATO states, but also the neutral and non-aligned countries actually came together and sit down at one huge negotiation table. So inclusivity is a really important trademark of those negotiations. Inclusive multilateralism was unique at the time. And this goes back to the invitation that Finland sent out prior to that. And they invited individual countries. They didn't invite alliances or blocs. Right? So everybody was there, at least nominally there, as a sovereign country, not as representative, first and foremost, of a military alliance. And that too was quite path-breaking at the time. This attempt to go beyond the blocs, beyond the division, and try something new. Another unique element of Helsinki was, besides the inclusivity, was the multidimensional nature of the agenda. So it's an awkwardly long name, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So the understanding of security and the understanding of cooperation was very broad and, for the time, path-breaking. So security was not equated was not defined in a narrow way. It wasn't equated with negative peace, right? So no armed conflict, for example, secure borders, but much more broadly. So the idea, and if you read Helsinki Final Act, it's spelled out there explicitly, the security of countries and the security of individuals residing in these countries were both of equal importance, which was a major innovation at the time. It's something that we now call human security. So if you want to trace the history of ideas and the history of human security as a concept, the Helsinki Final Act will be one important landmark agreement. It literally says that peace between states cannot be achieved if societies aren't at peace at home, meaning if individuals aren't endowed with certain inalienable inalienable rights. So the Helsinki Accord features a very robust provision on human rights: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, and so on and so forth. And then the Act makes this link and say, if you don't have these freedoms at home, we can't really speak of a peace that deserves its name. It was quite new at a time when most people thought about security. They thought about nuclear arms negotiations, some armaments, arms control negotiations, and so on and so forth. So long story short, there's an inclusivity that was new and pathbreaking at the time. The multi-dimensional understanding of what security means, also what cooperation means, that cooperation isn't just between governments, but it has to include what we would now call civil society as well. So these were all important innovations. And it is a bit of a miracle, even having worked on this for way longer than is good for me. It is still a miracle that this thing ever got done. And so we've got maybe around 35 people here in the room. If we started to negotiate on all of these issues, we'd be struggling probably to agree on everything, including all the fine print. Now imagine 35 states from different ideological camps with a long history of conflict, including, of course, the Second World War, and a lot of unresolved issues. Right? As we know, the Second World War didn't end with a peace treaty. And for the Soviet Union and its allies, Helsinki the attempt was to make it as much of a peace treaty, of a formal ending of the Second World War as possible. That was the view from Moscow. Helsinki's supposed to put the stamp of approval on the end of the Cold War, including on the frontiers that the war created. Right? So the goal there was Helsinki as the end of the Second World War. Okay, so this is sort of, in a nutshell, some aspects of why Helsinki mattered and why it was new at the time. Now, the question that I've asked myself for a very long time, and this is what the book is mostly about, is where is Britain in all of this? So when I took Anne's course in European International History, right here in this room, a long time ago, we read about sort of the Germans being involved in Helsinki because it was about borders. So it was also about the division of Europe. Would those borders be called, as the Soviets wanted them, immutable, unchangeable for all eternity, or would they be kept open for peaceful change in the future? So it was clear that the Germans, East and West Germans, had a stake. It was clear that the superpowers had a stake because the whole idea of Helsinki was a Soviet idea going back to 1954, when Molotov first floated the idea. It was then taken up in the 60s again by Brezhnev. The Poles, Rapatsky, also voiced these ideas. So this had been a long time coming, and it had been an idea from the Warsaw Pact countries. And because the Americans, of course, wanted to foster superpower Deighton, they basically grudgingly went along with this idea, and grudgingly, Kissinger very grudgingly went to Helsinki and participated in Helsinki for the benefit of superpower Deighton. Then, of course, there are the French. Since de Gaulle, the French pursued a very active policy of engagement with the East and tried, in the British view, a little bit too hard to foster a special relationship with the Soviet Union, so getting a little bit closer to the Soviet Union so as to maximize their room to maneuver with the Americans, and so on and so forth. But where's Britain in all of this? So in the literature that I encountered as a student here, there was a sort of a silence, largely a silence on Britain. Whole books have been written about many of the participants. There are 2 books on Switzerland alone, for example, Switzerland and the CSCE. But what about Britain? So to illustrate, I don't have my own book here, but I do have a book that several of you will recognize, Détente and Confrontation by Raymond Garton, which was on the reading list of the International History seminar, both the IR co-paper and of Anne's course. This is a book that has over 1,200 pages and is about Détente in general. And this was I emphasize, one of the books we were supposed to read for that week. I'm sipping old scores here. In all seriousness, it still holds up. It's a fantastic book. It is one of the seminal books about East-West negotiations during that crucial time, the 1960s and the 1970s. But if you read those over 1,200 pages, you don't find Britain in there. If you look in the index, Egypt is mentioned more often than Britain. Saudi Arabia is mentioned more often than Britain, and South Yemen is mentioned more often than Britain. Right? So the assumption was in the literature that Britain basically had no role there in this strange thing called Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. This has several reasons that I don't want to go into in great detail, but just to give you a flavor, I think partly the assumption was among scholars that it was a bipolar age. So let's first and foremost study the two superpowers, which kind of intuitively makes sense. And then let's study the Germans for the reason that I mentioned. Let's study the French for the reasons that I mentioned. And then we will get to the gist of this, right? We'll understand how this was negotiated and why and who did what. So this was how I started. The idea was basically Britain was sort of just going along with this. And it's a superpower-dominated affair, or dominated by the two continental European powers, the French and the Germans. Also, at the time, in the early to mid-1970s, Britain was a marginalized actor in East-West relations, which is ironic because in the book I situate the CSCE in a larger history of Britain's contribution to East-West negotiations. So I go back to the early 1950s. Churchill was one of the first leaders to call for negotiations with Stalin in order to overcome the incipience of Cold War. And I trace a sizable, significant British contribution from the early 1950s to the late 1960s. So it's not a sorry saga, as one scholar had said. Britain's engagement with East-West diplomacy was not a sorry saga, as one scholar called it. And it also didn't, in my opinion, foster, quote, hallucinations of grandeur not longer justified by realities, unquote. There's much more there, right? There's much more of a productive history there. Now, at the time, though, Britain was marginalized, and it was a little bit of what it was sort of, as one foreign office official called it, a leper of détente. Why? Because just a couple of years before the start of the CSCE negotiations, Britain's row with the Soviet Union over the espionage issue escalated, and Britain did something unique to this day, namely expelled the largest number of foreign diplomats in modern history. They expelled 105 alleged Soviet spies from the London embassy. 105. So today we're talking about 5 or 10, and that's a big deal. They expelled 105 on the grounds of alleged espionage. And that, of course, put Britain in the doghouse right at the time when all of its other allies, the French, the Germans, the Americans, were stepping up their détente game. So everybody was sort of going to Moscow or receiving Brezhnev, and there was a lot of hugging and kissing, and Britain was out of that entire game. Right? There was no summit, Anglo-Soviet summit for 7 years, right at the time when summitry peaked between East and West. So Britain enters the CSCE as a marginalized actor. Now, one of the main claims that I make in the book is, and this is also where the subtitle comes from, that actually Britain, despite its marginal position, ended up being one of the fathers of the final act. That's a quote from one of the interviews that I conducted for the study. It was important to me to have both archival evidence from all three groupings, East, West, neutral, and non-aligned, but also witness testimony from all three groupings. So I went off to all these different archives and also interviewed negotiators. And that quote is from one of the leading communist negotiators, Siegfried Bock, the head of the East German delegation. And he's sometimes referred to as the only non-Soviet diplomat to ever have played a significant role, because this was the Eastern camp was very much dominated by the Soviet Union, with the exception of Bock. And Bock says, essentially, there was a handful, 3, 4, maybe 5 delegations that really called the shots in Helsinki. that left their imprint on the final act and actually negotiated and actually wrote the 30-page agreement, and Britain was definitely part of that. So I then trace in the book, I trace Britain's contribution. So how did they evolve from being a marginalized actor to being a father of the final act? This did go in stages. It was also to some extent a rocky road. This is not a simple success story of Britain sort of showing up and then miraculously getting agreement from 34 other countries. But Britain did make very important contributions. I'll give you just one example to give you a flavor. Arguably the most important part of the final act is the so-called basket 3, which is where human rights, so specific commitments to fostering human contacts across East and West, and to fostering the free flow of information across East and West is written down. So there's a part of the final act that's all about large general principles, like the human rights principle that I already mentioned, that's basket 1. But it was a real intention of Britain and its Western allies to not have this agreement just be far-flung, sort of abstractly named principles, because then they're easy to ignore, right? So the idea was, if we have these general principles like human rights, we also have to have an operationalization. And so what does it actually mean in practice to foster human rights across the East-West divide? And that's basket 3. So basket 3 contains human contacts provision. So this is sort of mundane, everyday, but important stuff for individual citizens. So for example, families divided by the Iron Curtain, to allow them to reunify, for people to enable one another to marry across the East-West divide, to go on tourist trips, on business trips, and so on. That's all human contact. So it's really the stuff of daily life. It's not very abstract, it's very tangible. The same with the information provisions. So the final act contains a phrase that says that all the signatories commit themselves to facilitating the freer and wider dissemination of information of all kinds. Free and wider dissemination of information of all kinds. That was a phrase that the British negotiated directly with the Warsaw Pact, of all kinds. And part of that was, for example, for the time, a very new, almost revolutionary provision on journalists. The final act says that foreign correspondents must be able to do their jobs, even when behind the Iron Curtain. Right? They're not supposed to be expelled for allegedly engaging in spying and espionage, which was often the case. And also, if they hire local staff as translators, for example, that the local staff won't be harassed. All of this is explicitly in the final act. So very detailed commitments that are harder to ignore than the more abstractly phrased principles. And Britain made a cardinal contribution there because they essentially negotiated these two major aspects of the final act: the human contacts part of the final act and the information part of the final act. Why didn't the others do it? There are lots of reasons. Every other major player had their reason for not wanting to. Kissinger didn't want to engage with this because he knew that once you start talking about information exchanges and journalism, right, you're not going to get that far with the Soviets. And he didn't want to antagonize the Soviet Union because he had, in his mind, bigger fish to fry. His eyes were set on superpower Deighton, on SALT, negotiating a follow-up to SALT, and these sort of bilateral concerns. So he didn't want to engage with the negotiations. The Germans didn't do it because their primary goal was to insert a phrase about the peaceful change of frontiers in the final act. That was the number one goal of the West Germans, to not have Helsinki seal the borders, but have it acknowledge that the borders can be changed by peaceful agreement, thereby leaving open the path to reunification of Germany, but also the reunification of the entire continent. And the French, a bit like the Americans, also didn't want to antagonize the Soviets too much because they really wanted to foster a rapprochement between Paris and Moscow. So this doesn't leave a lot of players to actually negotiate on these highly sensitive and, for the time, novel ideas. And the Soviets and the Allies kept saying, this is not part of international relations, of East-West negotiations. We've never talked about these things. We can talk about disarmament, we can talk about the frontiers, but why are we talking about journalists? This has nothing to do with security. It has nothing to do with cooperation. This is just an irritation used by those who want to torpedo the entire negotiations and kill the negotiations. So over a very, very long time, almost 3 years, these things were negotiated, and Britain played a leading role in negotiating these most sensitive parts of the Helsinki Final. There are other elements which I'm not going to go into for reasons of time. Britain was also the NATO floor leader on confidence building measures, which is an often overlooked but very important part of Helsinki. We often equate Helsinki with human rights and their operationalization in basket 3, but they also it was also the start of a confidence building process. For example, if you do a major military maneuver within or close to somebody else's borders, you give advance notification. Or to increase transparency, you invite foreign observers to your military maneuvers. Things that are quite commonsensical perhaps now, but at the time, of course, were highly sensitive because of the sort of closed nature of military affairs in general and the Warsaw Pact military affairs specifically. Last point on this aspect, the Brits are, I argue, and I'm borrowing here from Andy's work, insider activists. So I love that phrase from Andy's book on global order, insider activism, because what it says is a lot of multilateral negotiations, and I think you can get flavor of by what I'm saying, is not that exciting, right? Like it's like bureaucrats and diplomats sitting down, negotiating, and so on. So it's not very flashy, and it's also quite hard to study because you don't have two players. It's not a unilateral or bilateral negotiation, right? You've got 35 players doing all kinds of things over 3 years. But an important part is actually the management of your respective group behind the scenes. And this was the first time, the Helsinki experience was the first time, for example, that the European community coordinated its foreign policy. Hadn't been done before. It just expanded from 6 to 9 members. Britain was part of that. And the Helsinki talk was the first time where there was a real effort, and a very successful one at that, to coordinate the foreign policies of these 9 countries. And Britain, despite being a newcomer and despite being sort of a leper of Deighton, they spent a lot of time basically just getting their own camp in order, making sure that the EC talks to NATO, that NATO talks to the EC, and then also, of course, to the other side. So there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes that never sees the light of day. It's never covered in the newspapers, certainly not on page 1. But it's very important. It's the backbone of diplomacy, is that sort of insider activism. So in a nutshell, I argue that Britain negotiated key human rights related provisions of the Final Act. I argue that they negotiated key confidence building measures, which was another important innovation of Helsinki. And I argue that they were the most important insider activists to get this unruly camp called the EC and this unruly camp called NATO in order. I was just about to ask, keep me in line. No, for a reason of time, I'm just going to skip over the slides and have people look at the cover. Okay, so why does this sort of micro study of this very specific negotiation matter? Well, for one reason, for one, it matters because it wasn't just an isolated negotiation. The Helsinki was a microcosm of East-West relations. They touched on almost every single important issue of East-West relations in that negotiation. So it wasn't just an accord on the specifics, it was an overall accord that touched on security and cooperation in the broadest possible sense. It also led to what I call in the book a bit of a comeback of British diplomacy. Once the Soviet Union realized that Britain's actually a key player, Brezhnev started to re-engage and let Britain out of the doghouse. So the leper of Deighton was suddenly invited to go to Moscow. And just before the signature of the Final Act, the first summit in 7 years took part. So there was a a local comeback, so inside the Helsinki bubble, which then had important reverberations for British diplomacy in general. So as a result of the success in Helsinki, they resurfaced basically as a major player in East-West relations, continuing this pattern that I described earlier that goes back to the early 1950s of Britain repeatedly trying to kickstart negotiations across the Iron Curtain. Now, to wrap up, there are larger ramifications of the book, which I spell out in the conclusion that go so beyond Britain. The book participates in a widening and a deepening of our understanding of the Cold War. So widening in the sense of looking at players that had so far been overlooked, Britain in my specific case, because if you just look at it from a bipolar perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The US was important for certain moments of the talks, but it wasn't a major player throughout the entire talks. So if you just look at the superpowers, it's a bit hard to explain why this thing started in the first place and then why it ended the way it ended with major concessions made by the Soviet Union, even though the US didn't really push for those concessions most of the time. So that's a widening of the actors that we need to consider if we really want to have a full understanding of these major milestone agreements. And then there's also a deepening of our understanding of East-West relations and also negotiations, in the sense that a lot of the book doesn't trace politicians. A lot of the book traces actual practitioners that actually negotiated the final. So it's really about officials, diplomats, doing so their daily business of slowly but surely sort of grinding away, trying to minimize literally word by word, sentence by sentence, comma by comma, minimize certain conflicts and gloss over those conflicts that you couldn't resolve and so on. So we have to, I think, deepen our understanding if we really want to understand how these things get negotiated. With the politicians, they came in at certain moments, like Kissinger came in, James Callaghan came in at a certain point, before him, Alec Douglas Hume. But this was really the tip of the iceberg. Right? So maybe 5 to 10% of the agreement were negotiated by the politicians. The rest was all pre-negotiated by diplomats. And this, I think, very nicely ties into the practice turn in IR theory, trying to understand major macro developments from the bottom up. And Helsinki is a great case study for this. And very final point, the 1970s are, for pretty good reason, usually remembered as the sort of the nadir of British power. Right? That's where so literally the lights went out because of power cuts and strikes. The IMF was called in to save Britain's finances. So I think that's also part of the reason why nobody had bothered to look into Britain, because it's just this assumption that the 1970s was when Britain's role as a significant player, let alone a world power, but even a significant player in Europe, really was over. And this then, I think, undergirds this narrative of British weakness. And then in the conservative reading of that history, the argument is then Thatcher comes along and saves Britain, right? Like brings back Britain as a significant player after this nadir of the 1970s. And in the book, I argue that the 1970s was never that nadir in the first place, because Britain, by integrating itself into the European community, which was a key player in Helsinki, by integrating itself into international organizations, there was a real transformation of Britain into what I call a sort of a networked power. And that is a story that shouldn't just be told as a story of loss of great power status, for example. Right? So change is more than loss. So I argue in the book that there's a real transformation, and often a productive transformation. The joining the EC, for example, was not sort of a grudging concession by a declining power alone. It was also an innovative way of regaining freedom to maneuver via collective diplomacy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kai. That must be one of the best overall summaries of CSCE negotiations and Britain's role in particular. So many thanks. I'd like to turn now to Paul Betts for some comments and observations that could take our conversations forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Kai, and many congratulations on the publication of this really excellent book. It's based on really extensive archival research, drawing on new findings from the NATO, Warsaw Pact, and non-aligned archives. Congratulations on that level. It's hard. It's part of what I think you kind of call a family tree of a relationship, kind of mystical relationship between places and ideas, right? I mean, Westphalia, kind of Versailles, Yalta, Schengen, and Helsinki, I think, has that kind of sense in terms of the city itself stands in for a much broader idea. In this case, kind of mid-70s European détente. And I think you make a strong case that it's biggest European conference since the Congress of Vienna in 1815. It's a huge gathering of 35 countries, and the difficulty of having pulled that off. And I think you make a very strong case, a very persuasive case, for the pivotal role of the British in this, and kind of displacing, I think, what has been in the literature, the centrality of the French, the West Germans, the US, and actually restoring a British role in driving this forward. I think that works very well. It's also good the way you just presented that in terms of it's Britain in a period of détente. And I think it's important that we not only British ideas of kind of dialing down the tensions of the Cold War, but kind of restoring a particular status on the world stage in terms of international relations. And I think it comes out very strong in the book, which you call the kind of comeback of Britain and challenging this older story of kind of narratives of turmoil decline that you often get in the 1970s. I think that's very important. Also good, I think, the way you brought out the kind of clashing perspectives. The Soviets are going in thinking this is an effort to bring to a close the Second World War, right? In a sense, to get international blessings for the Red Army occupation of Eastern Europe, while West is coming in a sense to challenge a kind of Cold War order and much more moving forward as opposed to consolidating what's on the ground. So that difference, which I think at one point you spell out between a kind of communist approach, which is static, divisible, and authoritarian, and the West you characterize as dynamic, holistic, and liberal. They're very different kind of clashing ideas, and how the West, and this is building on Richard Davies' work, is in many ways outflanked the Soviet Union, despite the fact it was often seen as a great Soviet victory, at least early on, especially by American conservatives that saw this as one in which the West was surrendering the freedom of tens of millions of people, which they had no right to do. Certainly, the way this played and helped build international profile for, well, at that point, the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, in terms of his criticisms of Gerald Ford at the time. So I think that's good. I think the way you kind of move this particular story into different territory, and also the language of human rights in terms of how this becomes highly politicized. It becomes something that for a lot of these Eastern European governments, they were surprised that their citizens took this as seriously as they did, often clipping out the results that were printed on page 1 of the Eastern European newspapers, and then often making efforts to shame their own national governments and the fact that they were not complying with what they had just signed up to do. And, it's somewhat ironic because the Soviet Union had signed up for the UN Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. That didn't seem to have any real political life. Well, 75, it made a huge difference and in a sense sets in train a range of kind of civil society reform movements, which I'll talk about in a second, which is also very important in terms of the long-term implications of this. I have just a couple of questions. I'm not really an expert on Helsinki, and I was just kind of things that I think were raised in the course of your book. You, in a sense, talk about the importance of negotiators and not politicians, and you just alluded to at the very end the role of the press. And I was wondering, in the British context, I mean, did these negotiators feel that they had the press on their side in terms of helping to publicize and popularize their negotiations, or was it a situation in which the press comes in very late? I mean, I'm just wondering about the relationship between the press and negotiators in terms of covering what was going on then in Helsinki. You also, I think, rightly point out, in this way builds on Richard Davies' book about the importance of the Basket Four, which is, in a sense, the follow-up conferences to, in a sense, grant Helsinki a future. It's not just a one-off event, but in fact, a had agreed to meet every few years to make sure that these governments are complying with a whole range of things they'd signed up for, including human rights issues. That, in a sense, there's a kind of lease on life in Helsinki that, that in a sense, pushes that into the future. The importance of that, certainly on the part of the Western negotiators, in making sure there would be a future of this negotiation, I think is really important. I want to ask a little bit about the actors involved. You, at various points in the book, talk about that there were good relations between the British negotiators and, let's say, the Eastern European negotiating teams, and not necessarily the Soviet ones, and that the Eastern European representatives were there as a way of carving out some room and maneuverability. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how they're building those bridges to their Eastern European colleagues during negotiations. And after, I'm thinking of Lorian Crump's book, The Warsaw Pact, where you consider there certainly a literature about the role of the Eastern European representatives. He talks a little bit about how the British were, in a sense, engaged with them, which I think was quite important. The same thing which you said, there were two books on the Swiss role. I'm just kind of wondering about the role of the neutral and non-aligned. I mean, Yugoslavians were there, of course, and as you say, the Egyptians were there, and they're kind of, they're representing a different constituency. And I'm just wondering if you talk about their effort on the part of the British to reach out to these countries that represent something very, very different. I'd like to move this a little bit in terms of talking about the geography of changing geography of Europe at the time, and the role of also cultural diplomacy, because you have the kind of event in 1975, you have a range of other kind of spin-off events. I mean, for example, in 1977, at the CSCE meeting, Yugoslavia proposed what they call a year of cultural cooperation to educate Europeans what they call European common heritage. So Helsinki is a diplomatic event, but it's also one in which they start talking about a kind of invention of history, in which they talk about that there's not just an effort to build European unity in 1975, but this is actually restoring much older historical story. And so the Yugoslavs have this kind of theater of cultural cooperation. In Bucharest, they have a European festival of friendship. So the whole range of kind of cultural spin-offs of the diplomatic world. And in the early 80s, the Polish and Hungarian governments are promoting what they call common European heritage. So it starts to take on a life, which I think is quite important. And this is all kind of background to what Gorbachev later called, the common European home. And of course, he's very, very inspired by Helsinki. So there's an effort to think about East-West relations outside the world of politics and diplomacy, but this is an older cultural heritage that can be then resuscitated across Cold War lines. You talk a little bit about the importance of mobility, of course, that 1970s, you have a number of people involved in the Borders for Peace program, in which a number of Yugoslavs are, of course, coming into Western Europe, especially West Germany in the 1970s. Huge amount of Poles that, there are some 50, 60,000 Poles that are traveling to Western Europe in the 60s. That's 10 times as much in the 70s. So it's against a background in which it's a huge amount of kind of continental mobility. And you could argue this is a kind of pan-Europeanism from below. So you have, in a sense, a political diplomatic relation, but you have a whole range of environmental, peace, gay and lesbian activity that's starting to happen across the world. Helsinki becomes a kind of inspiring document for them to drive reform from below. So Helsinki is working, as you say, on many, many levels. It's a kind of high diplomatic level, but it's also one which is taking on life elsewhere. The last point I want to talk a little bit about is your issue, which you call paracentrism, I think, toward the end of the book, and what you call inclusivity. I think that's certainly true for East-West European relations, but if you move outside of that realm, it's often not seen that way. I mean, for example, there are a number of African observers in 1975 that feel that East-West celebration of unity, common heritage comes at the expense of North-South relations. Some that may have been beneficial in terms of cutting off older fantasies of Euro-Africa, et cetera, but also in terms of North-South trade. And so that celebration of East-West unity is often seen at the expense of older, kind of more vertical North-South relations. I'm just wondering how you see that, because again, I can argue that 1975 is a kind of moment of East-West cultural unity, is one in which it sets in train a particular idea of 1989, which for a lot of African and Asian observers is also one which celebrates new relations between East and West Europe at the expense of older connections with the global South, what was then called the Third World. So Schengen is also seen as a kind of an acceleration of that trend of building East-West solidarity at the expense of an older story of North and South. So I'm just wondering in terms of how you see that. So I guess the question I have for you is that at the negotiating tables in Helsinki, was there any awareness that in a sense building relations between East and West would come at the expense of a different idea of geography, which is possibly kind of north-south? Those are just kind of some observations I have, and I must say I'm really, really pleased that kind of a younger generation of people are going into rethinking Helsinki. It's been one in which I think for decades is seen as a kind of more old-fashioned diplomatic history. I think you've gone in with some very, very fresh eyes and fresh questions. Yes, it's about, in a sense, restoring Britain's place to a much broader story, but it's much, much bigger, as you said toward the end of your presentation. And I guess the question I then have for you, and this is going to, I imagine, move into questions for our audience, is, what's the future of Helsinki? We certainly can talk about the past, and that it extends a particular legacy, but we live in a world in which these, as you say, it's a kind of masterpiece, I think that's what you call it, a masterpiece of very carefully prepared diplomacy that started in 1954 with Molotov. But, that the foreign offices just don't have those resources. They're not committed to that kind of very, very careful peaceful negotiation. Is this, in a sense, well, the reason we celebrate it, a kind of last hurrah of an older mentality, an older diplomatic structure? This kind of very well-resourced diplomatic corps could make this kind of possible in its lasting, as it's been, or corps, I should say. Or do you see in a kind of 21st century world where the 1975, in a sense, becomes a kind of fading kind of rear view mirror kind of view in terms of the power, the presence of what diplomacy can achieve, in a world in which it's very, very little of that on.
Thank you very much, Paul. So the catalyst question, whether CSCE is a catalyst for the future or the last hurrah, I think you said, from a post-war world that was still in the throes of the Cold War. Thank you. I'm sure we'll raise those discussions points later on. Tim, can I turn to you to
Thanks
your observation?
very much. I'm delighted. At 3:30 this afternoon, I got the invoice for Kai's book, which I'm glad to say I don't have to pay, but I haven't yet got the book. But I'm looking forward very much to the hard copy. But I have the PDF, so I've read it, and it's terrific. Many congratulations, Kai. Kai says at one point in the book that there was an estimated 9 million pages of paperwork produced in the negotiation at Helsinki, and has the impression that Kai has read them all. I want to make 4 points. And by the way, you've convinced me, if I needed convincing, that Britain was a father of the fire. One of. 4 points. First of all, as Paul already touched on, this reminds us how valuable and interesting diplomatic history can be. Diplomatic history has been massively neglected in the historical academic history for the last 35 years. This book reminds us how good it can be when it's done in a new way. It also reminds us how important really professional diplomacy is. I mean, it seems to me, Kai, correct me if I'm wrong, but the unsung hero of your book is a guy called Michael Alexander, who is a very distinguished but little-known British diplomat who played an extraordinary role in these negotiations in bundling together the 3 baskets into a package that made the thing possible. Second point, you're quite right, it's not a sorry saga, but I have to say that for me, as someone who is British and a British European, you have made me very sad. Sorry about that, Kai. Because this is a kind of monument to a period in which Britain did play a very important and constructive role, precisely through being an integral part of an integrating Europe. And Kai quotes an interview which James Callaghan, then Foreign Secretary, gave to the Times in 1975, when the Times, it may even have been Richard Davey at that time, asked him, what's the role of a medium-sized European country? And Callaghan's reply is, I quote, it is a role that is based on the influence that we exert mainly through our membership of international organizations. And Britain's role here was as a member of the European community. And so, the reflection I have is 1973 to 2016, RIP. Here were 40 and a bit years when Britain was playing this role precisely its membership, crucially, in what became the EU, but also other international organizations, partly because of its size, while in the EU it was one of the big three, but also because of the professional skills of its diplomats and officials, both in international diplomacy and in Brussels itself. Kai quotes someone in Moscow saying the EC delegation at the Helsinki conference were the mighty nine. The mighty nine. Well, I guess it's someone privately in Moscow today, although very privately, might talk about the mighty 27. You look at the power of the EU in relation to the Russia-Ukrainian war. But I can assure you, no one is talking about the mighty one, referring to Britain. So that's the second point. The third point, here I'm speaking as someone who actually witnessed this whole story from the late 1970s on. I touched upon it, but there is something I would call the Helsinki myth. The Helsinki myth is that there's a straight line that goes from the Helsinki conference from 1989 to 1991. Richard von Weizsäcker, Helsinki was, I quote, a human rights motor. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Helsinki, quote, had to lead to German unification. Had to lead to German unification. My favorite, because outrageous example, it was a conference in Warsaw in February 1990, where Henry Kissinger had been invited to speak. And Kissinger, as you were saying, was the most grudging person about the whole Helsinki process, and particularly about human rights. And Kissinger started his remarks by saying, it's a great pleasure to be here in Central Europe. And when we negotiated the Helsinki Final Act and put human rights at its very heart, we anticipated the magnificent effect this would have on the changes in Eastern Europe, the humbug, the cheek of it. But also more recent examples. Ed Luce, in his very good biography of Zbig Brzezinski, says in the intro, talking about the human rights interpretation of Helsinki, which actually the Carter administration and Brzezinski in particular was crucial. I mean, it wasn't so much about human rights as a process until the Carter administration comes along and the NGOs which make it and the visitors. And Luce says Helsinki planted, I quote, fragile seeds which bore, I quote, lethal fruit in 1989 to 1990. Now, whether I want my seeds to bear lethal fruit, I'm not quite sure. But in any case, and then he says, quote, and its harvest, among its harvest, was Poland's solidarity. Now, in these metaphors, and if I may say so, Paul, your metaphor too of setting in train, I think we have to interrogate it. Because all these metaphors suggest primary causality. And it's not a case of primary causality. And you indeed say this, as does Richard in his book. So the Helsinki Final Act and the process was an important framework. It was an important justification. It was an important legitimation. I was just looking up the the strike agreements that gave birth to solidarity. The Gdańsk agreement doesn't mention it. It only mentions the ILO. The Szczecin agreement does in an interesting way. I quote, "It was explained that the Human Rights Convention and the Helsinki Final Act had been published in print by the publishing agencies of the Polish People's Republic, and they will again be published in the form of brochures." So the point about information is important. But what it was not was a primary cause of the political changes as they came about in 1989. And indeed, that was not the intention even of the transformationists. If we can talk about the sort of conflict management people as you did in the transformationists. But there were a lot of people who saw it as stabilization and conflict management. Kai quotes an interview I did with Douglas Hurd, then British Foreign Secretary in 1989, when Hurd says, I was asking about the division of Europe, and he said, well, this is a system under which we've lived quite happily for the last 40 years. Right? I did have to point out that one or two other people hadn't lived quite so happily under that system, but he'd be quite happy for us to go on in this divided Europe for another 20 years, right? But even the transformation were envisaging a very slow process of controlled reform from above, of incremental evolution. None of them were envisaging a massive destabilization, regime change from below, an overthrow of the system. So I think that's an important point to make, and both Kai and Richard do make it. Finally, on this obviously important question of the future. And this is often posed as a question, does it set a precedent? Could we imagine a CSCE, a Conference on Security and Cooperation in the Middle East, leading to an OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in the Middle East? I wonder if that's the right way to pose the question. I wonder if the way to pose the question, and again, Paul touched on this, is not, is this in fact the product of a closed period of European history, advanced inclusive multilateralism in the context of a rather stable bipolar superpower relationship, which is not the time we're in. I was trying to think of examples of advanced inclusive multilateralism, which are still going. And there is one, the COP negotiations on climate change, right? Which actually are sort of Helsinki-like in the sense that it's a process, it's a series of review conferences. But of course, that's not going very well. But I think maybe the way to think about it is rather than asking, is Helsinki the precedent which we could imagine reproducing today? Let's look at what the challenges are today and how some sort of exercise in multilateral intensive diplomacy would address them. And if we ask that question, and this is just very tentative and provisional, but to open up the discussion, I guess we would single out three features, wouldn't we? First of all, that unlike them, this is a world of multiple great and middle powers, and not of a clear bipolar superpower relationship in a divided continent. And so in that sense, it's more like maybe the 19th or early 20th century than it is like this period. Secondly, unlike them, it is a period of unprecedented global challenges. There was, correct me if I'm wrong, Kai, but I can't think of anything except possibly the challenge of nuclear war, which in that time was addressed in a whole series of conferences and treaties and reviews, which quite compares with the challenge of climate change, for example. So that seems to be a second feature. And the third feature, it seems to me, would be the whole complex of commercial and economic interests in a world of globalized, financialized capitalism, right? So in the case of Helsinki, and I'd love to hear you on this, Kai, yeah, we had economic interests. The East European states were very interested in basket too, because they were getting into debt and they wanted to have more trade and more cooperation and more investment. But what you didn't have was the leaders personally being interested in business advantage, like Donald Trump or MBS or Erdogan. I mean, multiple strongman leaders of our time are personally interested, but we also have massive commercial players who have a great geopolitical impact. Example, Taiwan, the semiconductor firm, TSMC. This is a sort of absolute first order factor in the Western thinking about the Taiwan conflict. And I don't think we had actors like that in that time, let alone actors like Google or Facebook or Apple, these what I would call the private superpowers. So maybe, and this is just a suggestion for the discussion, maybe a different way of going at this is to kind of think about those distinctive new dimensions of our time. Those are just three. And then think how inclusive, intensive, multilateral diplomacy might actually be of some use in that very different world. But once again, Kai, many congratulations. It's a terrific book. Thank you.
Very much. We both Paul and was talking about the catalyst effect. And then Tim, who raised the question about actually it's those who heard great classic remarks in the early 60s about Britain losing an empire and not finding a role. Well, actually, those foreign office officials basically worked to turn that view of the world around. And to find their role, they had to do it within the EC, and the EC keeps coming back and back and back to British. And it's not just Alexander, it's Christine Skell, Pauline Neville-Jones. There's a whole gang of them who, once they got into the European community, basically wanted to shape the bits they could shape in the ways that they thought they should shape it. And it was a very, and talking to people at the time, it was a very powerful driver for them. So there's that role about Britain itself. And then this terrible old question about causality. It's a bit like the origins of the Cold War. We never get there. We reinvented and reinvent the way we look at the questions. But whether you can bookend what happened at 45, 46 and what happened 89 to 91 is going to be a lasting question for lots of very patient research students in the future. And then Tim's last point, where he's projected us forward to try and think about whether the CSCE is a kind of model, humanistic model, if you like, or whether it is an experience that gives us lessons, rather more objectively, lessons for future models. I think what I'd very much like to do now is to throw it open to this very well-informed audience for discussion, and then I'll let Kai pick up the pieces very briefly at the end, if you're happy with that.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So perhaps if you could be so kind as to introduce yourself before you ask your question, so we know who you are. 1, 2, 3. Yes.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sara Lorenzini, Cold War historian. And yes, so I started out as a historian of West Germany, and the story about the CSCE was very much told as, the success of East German foreign policy. And when I met Siegfried Bock back then, I wondered whether you met him recently, because I met him 30 years ago, and he looked very old back then. And so so it's fascinating what the argument they make, of this the CSCE as the moment where actually the UK gets back on the scene, right? But then, start looking at this story from my point of view, and I worked a lot on North-South relations, development, and later on the environment. Then it comes as a surprise, the story that you tell us about, the UK not being so central. Because in the very same year of the Helsinki agreement, then they were thinking about North-South relations. It's February 1975. It's the Lomé Convention, the year of the Lomé Convention, and then there. The UK did play a significant role starting 1971, and together, with the negotiations for access in the European community, and the whole majestic change in North to South relations, so that is, and in the relations between Europe and former colonies that is associated to Lomé is normally credited to this major impact of UK foreign policy. So I was wondering whether in working around the diplomatic negotiations in the CSCE, especially given that you mentioned, the non-aligned countries, which in my mind as a kind of traditional diplomatic history of the conference means Yugoslavia essentially, but I heard that you actually go into Egypt and consider other actors, and that comes as a surprise to me. And I was wondering whether you met anything of that, whether you met Lomé in this story. And this would be the first question, and then short.
You take that first question, and then you can have another bite of the cherry. If you have
Yeah.
Okay. And your question, observations.
So,
Who are you?
so first off, Max Watson, a DPhil candidate in military history, examining the failure of interwar multilateralism to mitigate emerging conflict. And these are two short, I promise, but interrelated questions. And the first is about this issue of intractability that you raised during your narrative that I find very interesting, because there were issues brought up over the course of this negotiation that would have seemed to be deal breakers for both sides, but that over the course of time and negotiation, these issues were overcome. And I'd be curious to hear more about how these seemingly intractable diplomatic issues were circumvented over time. And secondly, on this issue of intractability and building into the question of inevitability in the modern day, where it seems as though in a lot of modern diplomatic negotiations, there is a sense of not if, but when. Not if Russia will attempt to reclaim its empire in Eastern Europe, but when. Not if China will attempt to reunify with Taiwan, but when. And I would be very curious, and this is for the table, your thoughts on this kind of large form summit that has seen a decline in recent years, the role of the global south, of these middle powers in potentially once again circumventing these seeming inevitabilities diplomatically.
Thank you very much. And you managed to get into the second question without drawing breath. Very smart. It's a lesson. Okay.
Thank you, David Madden, European Studies Centre. How would you position the quadripartite agreement on Berlin as an important stage on the road to Helsinki?
That's a nice detailed question for you.
Just a small question about an issue you touched on briefly, which is the relations with the press. I knew some of these characters who were involved in the negotiations, and I was struck at the emphasis they placed on being sure to brief two classes of people in London when I went to them. That was the press and MPs. And they did it precisely because they had witnessed in America what happened when international negotiations were not fully briefed at the right time by those making the decisions, with consequences that we know, extreme suspicion. So was that question, were they right in thinking that they could make improved relations with the press? And that leads on to another question, which will, in my end, very good. Meeting Christian Tickel, who was not short of, I think one might, in a cruel moment, think I was hubris, but anyway, he did often talk about his role in negotiation in this way. And he did imply, not convincingly, I thought, from the start, they did have some vision of what the future of Europe might be, as being European, as being influenced by the decline in the belief in communist doctrine, and as Europe that would be dominated by questions such as the ones I mentioned about environment. So it was arguable that there was a bit of a line negotiated and what subsequently happened.
And just as a footnote, Tickel has a very big role in Kai's book. I don't know if you've seen the famous PDF yet, but Tickel is all over it. Right, Kai, there you are. And you've got no time at all.
How many hours? do I
No,
have?
you
Yes.
haven't.
Okay, since all of you have been so patient and not everybody might be as fascinated with Cold War history, I'll start with the present day. This was raised by several people here. Of course, it's a very different time. As I also mentioned in my introduction, this was a time when the Soviet Union was a status quo power, and it did try to use that form of advanced multilateral diplomacy to get the stamp of approval for the borders, implicitly also for the Brezhnev doctrine, of course. So there's a whole political and geopolitical shadow agenda that was, of course, the Brezhnev doctrine was not officially on the agenda, but it was part of the shadow agenda of the CSCE negotiations. So it's a very different time, right? Obviously, we've got a revisionist Russia. The question is, how far does that revisionism go? But it is a very different time. That being said, and we haven't mentioned it today, and I think it's quite telling that we haven't mentioned the OSCE, because it is, I would argue, a almost criminally underused and underrated organization. It's a direct offspring of the Helsinki negotiations, the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And while it has not been able to mediate on Russia's war against Ukraine, it still is an important organization that by now has decades of experience and expertise, including in grassroots engagement. So they do little, sometimes very small things like educating journalists in authoritarian countries. A lot of you will have heard of the election monitoring, which is maybe the most visible part of the OSCE. But it is an important organization. It's the world's largest regional security organization with now 57 members, plus associated members. And it is the only inclusive organization left on our continent. So it is, so Ukraine is a member of the OSCE, Russia is a member of the OSCE, the United States is a member of the OSCE, and so on and so forth. And I think probably not now, but I do think that there is a role to play for such an inclusive organization. Maybe paradoxically, because it's marginalized and hardly anybody talks about the OSCE. that maybe could be an advantage for the organization, because should Russia decide to re-engage diplomatically, but it has these two options: the spectacular summits, like the Alaska summit, which went nowhere. That's of course the option, right, where statesmanship and showmanship are one. Or it has the alternative option, which is to use low-level, working-level diplomacy. And this is where the OSCE can shine, although it would shine behind closed doors, to kind of mix metaphors. So there should be an open door for that low-level engagement. And the OSCE is the institution that we have. We don't have to reinvent it. It's already there. But I think it lacks the imagination of key member states is lacking, and the will to re-engage with the OSCE. But it's there, and it's, I think, ready to play an important role, potentially at least, an important role in the future. Now, on the many other questions, I will refer to the drinks reception at St. Antony's afterwards, where I can talk at you for another hour. But just a few points that were raised by multiple people. So, in a way, this goes back to Tim's point about a monument to European Britain. And the project, because it's been a long time in the making, it's a pre-Brexit project. That started long before Brexit. But of course, while I was writing up the book, I did feel a bit of the nostalgia that Tim alluded to, because this was a time when Britain joined the European community. As I said, it was the first international negotiation that the EC ever tried its hands on. Even the Commission was part of it in a limited way in Basket 2. And the British were, I was surprised how good they were in accepting this multilateralized, constraining but also enabling forum, the European community. And I interviewed Crispin Tickell, Brian Fall, George Walden, and several other diplomats. And Brian Fall was, together with Crispin Tickell, at the very first coordinating meeting. This was before Britain had officially joined the European community. There was already a pre-meeting, because the number one item on the EC agenda was the upcoming Helsinki negotiations. And the Brits were very good, both in terms of larger political points, but also in terms of personal engagement to slot themselves into this existing organization. For example, every member state has the right to speak their own language. But before that meeting, Tickell talked to Brian Fall and said, let's speak French, because it is a French-dominated organization. So the first meeting, the Brits show up, and of course everybody expects them to speak British, like Oxford English, but they show up and speak in fluent French. And that is just a little gesture, right? It's a little symbolic gesture, but it did signal that the Brits were there to play a constructive role. And I document this in the book. They did play a constructive role, both within the EC and in East-West negotiations. And there are three reasons why the Brits were so successful, and one is institutional. They were a member of both the EC and NATO, gave them a privileged position, and they played constructively within the confines of these institutions. So institutionalization is a very important point. Britain would not in a million years have had anywhere near the impact had it not been a member of these two organizations. For most of the negotiations, and Tim also alluded to this, the EC, the Mighty Nine, were actually in the driving seat, partly because of Kissinger's reluctance to engage in value-based foreign policy, talk about human rights, and this whole multilateral mess. So I call it the CSCE, quote, multilateral diplomacy gone amok. So institutionalization plays a big role. The second major reason why Britain was so successful was basically the soft power of those liberal ideas that they put on the agenda. And they put this Warsaw Pact states in a really awkward position. So, for example, there was a moment when the Vatican, first conference in, I think, 100 years that the Vatican actively participated, was at Helsinki. There was a moment when the Vatican really insisted on freedom of religion being an explicit part of the final act. And it came to this moment where there was about to be a showdown between the Soviet Union and the Vatican on this point. and the Soviets chickened out. They understood it looked very bad if we start negotiating vis-a-vis and against the Holy See on this issue of freedom freedom of religion. So the soft power, these liberal values did play a
Could
role.
you just add to that, to Adam's point about whether there was a deliberate policy of engaging with appropriate press outlets? So I thought that's a very important one, and that's part of this second. If you could
Yes.
just do that, and we can weave it into the questions.
Yes, so they did brief the press repeatedly. There was a small but very engaged circle of British journalists, including, of course, Richard Davey, who covered the entire process from the pre-meeting in 1972 to the signing in 1975 and onwards, who were extremely well informed, who, unlike, I have to say, a lot of their American colleagues actually read the final act when it came out, so they actually knew what they were talking about. And I didn't find conclusive evidence on this, but this explicit endorsement of journalism that I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't be surprised if this was to some extent sort of a gesture by the British diplomats towards those interested journalists to really push for this very explicit endorsement of the freedom of the press. And the last point that I wanted to make, so institutionalization played a role, soft power played a role, but then the last point, and many of us touched on this, is diplomatic agency. Right, so diplomatic skills are not evenly distributed across all foreign ministries. I generally don't know how it is in the present day Foreign Office, but back in the day, these were extremely well educated, very well experienced negotiators, and a lot of the negotiations did take place in English, so they had the advantage of being a native speaker. So when pen had to be put to paper, a lot of the Brits actually just did the writing. And of course, a lot of them at the time, Michael Alexander being a good example, spoke and wrote fluent Russian. So they produced not just the English version, but they immediately also produced the Russian version and gave both to the other side. And then when the Soviets were sneaky, and then they agreed to the English language version, but then messed around with the Russian translation, those negotiators they spotted this, right, and then called them up on it. So diplomatic agency, diplomatic skill does matter, right? And there's a lot of praise in the interviews that I did, and also in the documents that I saw from other archives, right, non-British, non-English speaking archives, both in the Warsaw Pact and in the Neutral Online. It's a lot of appreciation for the skill that a lot of these diplomats had.
While you're talking about the diplomats, could we just go back to your point about the development side of Lome? Are you saying that there was a part of the FCO that was doing this, and yet there's another bit that's got quite a high profile already in the early to mid 70s? Now, I know this is off your narrow trajectory, but perhaps I think it'd be very interesting to know whether you felt this was part of a general trend within the FCO after we got into the EC, or whether this was, as you argue, particular to the Helsinki process.
Yes, I'm not an expert on Lome. In the CSCE, the second basket, which dealt with economic issues, probably was the least important and least innovative basket. There really was a lot of attention on confidence building measures, on human rights, on cultural exchanges, on journalism, and so on and so forth. I think it does matter to some extent whom you send to these negotiations, and then also how long these negotiations take. And this tells us a little bit, I think, about the practice turning in international relations and so on. So the longer these negotiations continue, and I talk about this in the book more, the more they develop into, so I call them bubbles, right? These multilateral bubbles. And who is the most powerful inside this bubble often doesn't align with who is considered to be the most powerful outside of these bubbles. So you would expect, of course, the superpowers, right, to be in the driver's seat for all the conventional reasons. But actually, it's often not the case. And if you talk to practitioners, which of course many of you have done, they often talk about punching above one's weight. Oh, we didn't expect country X to play such an important role, but they were really punching above their weight. since the COP negotiations were mentioned, I've written a paper on South Africa. Right? South Africa plays a really important role, disproportionate role in climate negotiations for various reasons, but including the diplomatic skill of the lead negotiators. They send the same team to the various COPs. There's a lot of continuity. So there's a middle power that actually punches above one's weight. And I would make the argument that this is one of the genuinely new things that this advanced multilateralism, that intense multilateralism that we talk about, does. It does distort and to some extent create its own power dynamics. So you can't just project the power hierarchies that are out there in the international sphere into these bubbles. There usually are different power dynamics at play. So I'm not arguing that Britain was a great power in the 1970s across the board, right? That's not the point. But I do argue that inside this very important bubble, they played a disproportionate role. This is something that something new that multilateralism brings to the table. It's not just a replication of power dynamics from outside these bubbles. There's something new happening there, which gives voice opportunities to actors that otherwise might be excluded. So often you're just not invited to the table. And if you're not invited, or even if you're invited to the table, you might not have a say over the agenda. At these multilateral meetings that we're talking about, both is not the case. So people are invited, it's inclusive, and everybody can have their say over the agenda because all of the negotiations were done by consensus. So a small country like Malta, and they used this one time at the very end of negotiations, can veto the entire thing. And there was a moment just before the signature of the final act when Malta actually insisted on a very specific point, and everything grind to a halt, and everybody panicked, and then they appeased Malta, and then Malta said, "Yes, you may proceed."
Does that, in a way, answer the question about deal-breaking moments for you?
Yeah.
I mean, Berlin.
The intractability question in Berlin. So a lot of conflicts weren't solved; they were just papered over. And that's also part of everyday diplomacy. Like a good diplomat, right, can give you 10 different formulations for the same issue, and one of them will probably be acceptable to everybody. So there were a lot of things that were just basically shelved and talked about in a vague way that allowed everybody to save face. So that also did happen. But I do think there was genuine agreement on certain issues. Berlin was an important step on the road to Helsinki. So without a successful Berlin Agreement, I think that was 1972, correct me if I'm wrong, or 71. So,
it was 70, 71.
Yeah. So this was about the four major powers agreeing, and again with a lot of diplomatic finessing, certain fine points on the status of Berlin. So this was a help to open the door for Helsinki, because those four powers would have been extremely reluctant to enter this large multilateral arena with important points being unresolved over Berlin. Just like the two Germanys really want to settle key issues among themselves first before going to Helsinki. So in a way, the imminence of a multilateral meeting also speeds up bilateral diplomacy, because people are afraid that they might be called out in a larger meeting on specific points if they haven't done their homework bilaterally beforehand. There's an acknowledgement of the special status of Berlin throughout these negotiations. So Berlin wasn't forgotten, but the picture was a larger picture. It really was about the division of Europe, and this pivotal phrase that's in the final act, principle one, so very prominent position at the beginning of the final act, does say that frontiers can be changed in accordance by mutual agreement and in accordance to international law. And to this day, you read a lot of misunderstandings in the press saying, "Oh, Helsinki cemented the status quo because it said that borders are inviolable." And this is diplomacy here. Inviolability and immutability are two separate issues. Inviolability means you can't attack borders, because Russia has done vis-a-vis Ukraine. Immutability is the cementing, and they didn't get immutability, they got inviolability, but coupled with this dynamic element. The borders can't be assaulted, but they can be changed. This dynamism that also Paul mentioned is very important. Right? It was a dynamic it was a start and was understood to be, including by the Brits, to be the start of a process, not a one-off. The Soviets wanted a one-off stamp of approval of the status quo. They had to concede follow-up conferences where you then could implement, you could monitor and then see the implementation record of one another. And I think this is something that maybe today, because we live in such a fast-paced time and we're running out of time as I speak, we tend to forget. Right? These are complicated issues that can't be solved with one sub from Alaska, for example. Right? This is bound to fail. This is bound to fail, given the complexity of these issues. You usually do need these follow-up processes, and let the adults in the room do the work.
It's not a big business deal. Yes, question.
Thank you. My name is Mehdi Scaurier. I'm Research Director at Hebel Campus Science and Technology. I'm going to ask you one very brief question, and I hope it does not sound ill-informed. But the final act of Helsinki, within the as a conclusion of the CSCE, Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe. What will Egypt and the aided South Yemen, as you referred to, what were they doing?
Yes, thank you for asking this question.
That's a big question.
Because there's a misunderstanding. So South Yemen, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia were not part of the negotiations. They are just covered in masterpieces of the Détente literature more than Britain does. So my point was that South Yemen gets more attention when it comes to East-West relations than Britain did. But this goes back to the European point, Paul's important point, that in a way the CSCE, because it was focused largely on Europe, although it did contain the two North American members of NATO, I think Canadians were there and the Americans were there. But it did, of course, build on previous notions of an inclusive Europe, where the countries east of the Iron Curtain weren't Eastern European; they were Central Europeans, and so on and so forth. So it did build on older notions of Europe and reinforced those. And there was actually a moment in the negotiations where an Italian diplomat sort of jumped up and said, sort of exclaimed sort of ecstatically, "This is Europe! Like, this is a rebirth of Europe that we're seeing here." Because it was not a block-to-block negotiation, and everybody was invited. All the states of Europe were invited. Everybody came except for Albania, because there were Maoists and abstained. But everybody else came, even the smallest ones. Right? So San Marino was there, Liechtenstein was there, and grilled the Soviet Union on its human rights record, and so on and so forth.
And the Soviet Union as a European power.
And it reinforced this notion of the Soviet Union as a European power. There were Middle Eastern countries who asked to join. So there was a negotiation early on in the CSCE. How far does this definition of Europe go? And then when several Arab countries asked to join, Israel asked to join as well. And the Brits, and I have a couple of short quotes in one of my learned footnotes buried somewhere deep inside the book. The Brits were very clear. This is already messy enough. 35 is enough. Like, we're not going to import the problems from the Israel-Palestine conflict into this negotiation. But the more southern members of the EC, the Italians, the Maltese as well, they had far more sympathy. They wanted a broader understanding. And there is actually a declaration on the Mediterranean in the final act. And that was a nod to this idea. So they were well aware that they needed to somewhere draw the line and define sort of a core Europe and then adjacent countries. But this was basically a political construction of Europe, and the CSCE construction of Europe is still with us today in many ways.
Guys, we haven't got much time. We've got two more questions. So if you forgive me, if we could take those two questions, as you responded very fully so far. Paul.
Paul Clever at Mansfield. I just wanted to join Paul Betts's train because I actually feel there are quite clear links between Helsinki and leading up to the Great Revolutions of '89. I've just come back from Prague, where I was participating in the Forum 2000 conference, which was set up by Hebel as a sort of annual get together of leading human rights experts and intellectuals. And they were celebrating Helsinki 50 years on, very much as the motor or engine for the setting up of Charter 77. And I think, you know, the Charter 77 had a pretty significant role to play in what happened in Czechia. I then went on to Brno, where to open an exhibition which actually celebrated the work of the British, particularly the Oxford professors and academics who gave a series of underground lectures, which was picking up this link from Helsinki, which was to have, you know, sharing of information and the freedom to study and so on. I was personally involved in it. That's why I went there. I'm hoping to bring that exhibition to Oxford. I just think that I agree one can overstate it, Tim, and it can be a bit of a myth, but I do think there are threads that, you know, shouldn't be ignored. And actually, it's the dissidents themselves. I mean, several dissidents were at the opening and spoke, who actually referred directly to the 50-year anniversary of Helsinki.
Two super quick questions. So first, I'm very curious to know.
Can you, sorry,
I'm so sorry. I'm Dorian Singh. I'm at St. Cross and DPIR. How would you describe the UK? So with respect to the human rights basket, how would you describe the UK? Was it particularly active? Was it particularly cautious about adding these provisions and clauses, given sort of the tensions it would have felt as a new EC member, given the tensions? So question around sort of cross pressures, and was it active or was it sort of kind of elbowed into a corner to what was its view about these provisions? And then the second question is really just more about your methodology. I'm just kind of curious to know that when you went through the extensive archives and personal papers and these interviews, I mean, was there something that really changed your view, your understanding about Britain's role? Was there something that surprised you the most?
Great questions. Thanks very much. Yes, so the train and the seed, but lots of great metaphors. And this also goes a little bit back to Adam's question about the vision. So the Brits did think about Helsinki very closely before they started, and they did have, I wouldn't say a grand strategy, that I think is overstating it, but they did have, they did write down several core desiderata that they must achieve, and robust human rights commitments were one of them. Not necessarily a general principle, but actually concrete commitments, like I said earlier, family reunifications, marriages, student exchanges, journalists, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, is textbook liberalism in a way. So there was a genuinely liberal element to Britain's ambition, on top of and in addition to the Cold War propaganda aspects. Right? They knew that once you start talking about these liberal ideas and liberal commitments, it'll be extremely awkward for the Warsaw Pact states to negotiate. Right? It's slippery terrain that had previously been just ignored in East-West diplomacy. Helsinki was the first time where this was front and center. And this is also because a couple of you asked about the neutral and non-aligned. These liberal values were important because a lot of the neutrals were Western leaning. The Swiss, the Austrians, the Swedes, for example. And then when push came to shove and the whole negotiation stalemated on these human rights aspects, the neutrals basically were swing voters. They said, no, this must be in the Helsinki Final Act. And then it's a numbers game. The Warsaw Pact was outnumbered. They could have vetoed it, but they also knew that it would look extremely bad, just like it would look bad to negotiate with the Vatican. But the Brits did hope and expect that over the long run, increasing liberalization of Central and Eastern Europe would lead to a transformation. But they really expected this to be a slow, long-term process. And they also wanted it to be a slow and long-term process because they did not want another Prague Spring. They did believe that escalations or hypermobilization of civil society might elicit yet another clampdown by the Soviet Union. So they really wanted evolution, not revolution. And that was an ambition from the start of the negotiations. So it's not like Dan Thomas in the Helsinki Effect, a dear colleague of mine, argued that the liberalization and the end of the Cold War ran against the ambitions of Western diplomats. That's not correct. It was part of the ambition, but the ambition was this is going to be a long-term process, evolution, not revolution. On Dorian's quick questions, quick answers, the Brits were extremely active in the human rights domain. They were actually the most active. I don't use a lot of quantitative aspects in the book. It's a qualitative study. But if you do a tally of the human rights related proposals submitted at Helsinki, part of those 9 million, or actually it was 10 million pages of documents generated in those 3 years, the Brits were, along with the French, the most active drafters of proposals. They wrote twice more human rights related proposals than the West Germans, 3 times more than the Dutch, and 14 times more than the Americans. So they're extremely active. And your last question about the smoking guns or the revolutionary things. I mean, the phrase "fathers of the final act" that was a bit of a godsend because it really encapsulated something important there. But other than that, it really was a lot of kind of digging for gold deep inside the minds of an East German archive and so on. But sometimes, maybe the most revelatory moments were when I went and asked a witness, an eyewitness like Siegfried Bock, having done the archival evidence first. The East German delegation is my last point. It's also hopefully a little bit of a joke. The East Germans wrote a long rundown at the end of the Helsinki Final Act after the signing ceremony to the leadership, to Honecker, and said, "We negotiated successfully with a class enemy." That's the phraseology. It was also used in internal documents, right? This was purely internal documents. We staved off all kinds of attempts at subversion, ideological, political. We won on all of the major points and made only minimal concessions in getting there. And then I went to Siegfried Bock in East Berlin, and I did ask him, "Did you actually mean it?" And he said, "Of course not." Like, you could not report the truth to the leadership. So he knew at the time that this was a highly stylized version of what actually happened. And they did know that although they did also get some of their points, they did have to make a lot of painful concessions on the frontiers aspect that we talked about, on the human rights aspect that we talked about, and on the process element. They didn't want a process. They wanted a one-off conference.
Well, Kai, it's going to be a good long read for everybody, and I think we'll all learn a great deal from the book. I know that I have over these years, and I think we would like to please join me in thanking Kai for talking, and to our commentators. They're really just